Thank you. Thank you. During the 4 sessions this weekend, many of you at many points will be shocked, not by the choice of language, I believe, but by the fact that in a period in which the Supreme Court of the United States has said that innocence is no reason to stop an execution, that anything that is said in the direction of telling the truth tends to be shocking. Is going these days. Justice is not a word which commands anymore. We are now in the next 18 to 24 months, the world is gripped with the most dangerous, most momentous, and most profound developments in the past 5 centuries of human history. At stake is the question of whether we shall emerge from the 1990s into a prolonged new dark age which will engulf this planet for 100 or 200 years to come, a dark age in which the population of this planet will sink from over 5 billion to, at most, a few hundred million. A time, a dark age in which a nightmare beyond belief will control this world. Or we can salvage the achievements of civilization to date, and those achievements which were given by the development of a revolution which began in Europe between 550 and 510 years ago. Between the Council of Florence, which established a new principle to govern all states, all society, not a principle which was immediately put into effect completely, but a principle which began to work to change the world. And about 510 years ago, a little more than that, the end of the monarchy of France's King Louis XI, who in the 20 years of his reign established the first civilized form of society on this planet, as I shall explain, which was called by him a commonwealth, in which all the citizens of the nation were bound together to build the nation so that the nation might foster the well-being and development of every individual in it. The principle was that every person on this planet is made in the living image of God the Creator. This image, as I shall indicate today, is not a bodily image, not a graven image. It is an image of intellect. It is an image of a creative power of intellect, which no animal species has. The issue is of this battle of the coming 18 to 24 months, the battle that will decide the future of mankind for centuries to come, in which we play a part in that battle. Is man, as Prince Philip, the fascist beast, says, is man a higher ape, or is man a creature in the living image of God the Creator by virtue of creative intellect? That is what the issue is. Are all men created in the living image of God the Creator? Or are men merely beasts to be kept in zoos called nations? Beasts to be slaughtered when they're too numerous? Beasts to be used as chattels? That's the issue. That's the issue. I'll say at this time, symbolically, there's a man running for president. He should be running from it, not to it. His name is Senator Phil Gramm, and he has the most high-priced brains in America. As Wade Watts would explain to you, his brains are so high-priced because they're brand new, they have never been used. Now, this idiot typifies, he's an energy saver. He turns his brain off before his mouth starts moving. This man typifies the enemy because he typifies the disgusting depths to which people degrade themselves when they go over to join the side of the enemy of Prince Philip, the consort, the royal consort. That's like the royal stud of the Queen of England. All right, now let's start with this graphic number 1 on the right screen. I presume the graphic people are ready to do graphic things and adjust the lights. No, this is not, no, graphic 1. The graphic 1 is the screen number 1, graphic 1. You got the wrong 1. That's not 1. That's 4. Okay, here we are. Just ignore that. Don't put that on the screen yet. We're not ready for that. Okay. A little management problem here. Now, first principle. Man is not an ape. We'll come back to this several times. We're going to look... Yeah, it's good. Man is not an ape, a higher species of ape. Man is not an animal. Man, every individual person, not man as a species, but every individual person ever born is a creature made in the living image of God by virtue of a power of creative intellect, and therefore has certain sacredness of existence, rights, and obligations which no animal has. However, what's the condition of mankind? Well, people have found traces of what they believe to be human life going back about 2 million years. That is, of the recent Cainozoic period, as it's called. Now, we should look at some of that, the more recent part of it. Now, if man were an ape, or even a very gifted, special kind of ape, then man would have the potential population density and other population characteristics of a higher ape. If man were a higher ape, then during the entire period of the past 2 million years on this planet, of the recent Cainozoic, at no point would the number of living human individuals have exceeded several million. Prince Philip, as usual, is wrong. Over a period of time, and we should look at some of this today, the human population by the 13th century in Europe had finally scrabbled up to about 250 to at most 300 million individuals. Then this revolution happened. Between 1439 and 1483, from the beginning of the Council of Florence to the death of the King Louis XI, who established that first form of modern society which we find reflected in a direct tradition from the Council of Florence and Louis XI's France, his Commonwealth, reflected in the creation of the Federal Constitutional Republic of the United States. The preamble of the Federal Constitution, like similar sentiments expressed in the Declaration of Independence, express an idea which is opposed to everything British empiricism stands for, opposed to John Locke, opposed to Adam Smith, opposed to Jeremy Bentham, opposed to the British monarchy. An idea which comes directly from the Council of Florence, a conception of society which comes directly from the initial work of Louis XI, King of France, in establishing France as a commonwealth. The general welfare clause of that preamble is outstanding in that respect. Everything the United States stands for, especially in its fight against the British Empire and the oligarchical evil of the old world, against the Confederacy, and against similar kinds of evil, everything for which the United States stands, for which Lincoln stood, for example, flows from that. And everything good about the United States flows from that role of this nation in continuing until 1901, until Teddy Roosevelt moved in continuing the struggle on this planet against the forces of oligarchism typified by the British monarchy. What's the significance of that? As a result of changes in the institutions of society, which were laid down in principle by people such as Nicholas of Cusa in the Council of Florence, and which was set into motion for the first time in a first good approximation by Louis XI in that 20 years of his reign as King of France. The population of this planet has increased from not more than 300 million, probably less, in the 13th century to 5.3 billion or more today. And that should occur. The break point between the two curves of population is that. The change, a revolutionary change, in the way in which the state defined man and defined society is the reason for the growth of population. That's not all. Not just increasing of the numbers of people. This is an old idea. The idea of man in the created of the image of God dates to Moses, the first book of Genesis, the first chapter of Genesis, verses 25 to 30, 26 to 30 in particular. Man is made in the image of God. And as Philo Judaeus of Alexandria said, this is man, not the image of God, not a bodily image, not a physical image, but an image of the mind, of intellect, of creative powers of intellect. Every person is born in the image of God in that way. Well, that was something which was given to the Hebrews by Moses, through Moses. Then came Christianity, and especially the evangelism of the apostles John and Paul. And the idea that every person on this planet, Gentiles as well as Hebrews, was created in the image of God. That was a message which the apostles carried to the oppressed in the Roman Empire. But even with Christianity took power in Europe officially, the state did not recognize that. The condition of mankind from the oldest reaches of time that we know until that change between 1439 and 1483 was 95% of the population of every society on this planet, every culture. 95% lived in a condition of toil, comparable to that of serfs, slaves, or under the Aztecs, worse. It is not merely we've increased the number of people, but for the first time we began to burden the state with the duty of efficiently responding to the challenge of bringing the 95% of the population out of a condition tantamount to serfdom, slavery, or worse. So, mankind on this planet today has potentially a better condition of life, every person, than existed for 95% of the population in all history before this time, in all prehistory. Let's look at some of the characteristics. Let's go to populate the chart number 2 on that far side. That's the one with the long table. Put that on first. You can see we get the right one now. This is always a bit talk about gambling. It's a little dark. Hard to see. I'm not sure what is there. Was it quit on us or what? Oh, there we are. There we are. Get that in focus. Can you see that? All right, you'll find that this chart is also in the EIR, this week's edition, which most of you probably have acquired. And you find it also in there. I shall simply refer to it here. Let's see. All right. But in any case, this gives an indication of what is known. These generally academically accepted estimates of population and life expectancies over the known recent prehistory of mankind as compared with some of the characteristics of population density, life expectancy, and population size of higher apes. So we see that in this process, as we've seen in a different way in the other chart, we see how mankind has progressed in this process. And what I want to focus your attention on is the relationship between man in the image of God and the increase of human population and the potential improvement of the human condition, which has occurred particularly over the past 550 years. But a factor of change which was also present in mankind prior to that 15th century revolution. What does man do that no beast can do? No species of beast can do. What does this creative power of intellect have to do with the potential population of mankind? How can mankind, who according to the Prince Philip, who should know, after monkeying around with that queen, that he insists that man is a higher ape. Biologically, man does seem to be a somewhat higher ape, who should have a population potential of a higher ape. Now, how come we got a different one? Did we change physically? Are we endowed? No, I think a baboon probably has a better scrape at getting a living in the wilderness than a man does these days. He's better equipped. He's a better food gatherer than Phil Graham, for example. What is it about man that makes man so exceptional? Well, now look at that chart now and think about it. Now what you're looking at there is, compare it with animal ecologies, as they're called. Now, an animal does not have a fixed size of its potential population. An animal has a range of potential population density, which varies with all kinds of conditions. But the animal doesn't change that much. The animal can adapt to conditions, but the animal cannot revolutionize the conditions. So therefore, the animal will have a lower level at which it tends to become extinct, and the animal will have an upper level at which its population will tend not to grow, varying with the conditions, the competing species, all that sort of thing. Right? Now, if you look at man, these different levels of society, as we'll look at it again in a moment, See, man seems to have passed through an evolutionary progression of species. If we look at population densities, we find that man, in going from one mode of existence to another, increases the range of potential population density of the human species. And at the same time, we also notice that life expectancy rises. The number of infants and children who survive puberty in order to become producers of children increases. In the beginning, it's rough. The average life expectancy of a person in a food-gathering society is significantly less than 20 years of age. So we see this increase is occurring. We say, wait a minute, man is evolving. Man is becoming a higher animal than he was before because he's got a higher population density. He's changed his nature, but he didn't. He didn't. I don't think people in my family have been getting much better over the past 200 years. I don't see any biological improvements there. As a matter of fact, I seem to get some of the inflictions, the genetically inclined inflictions that my ancestors did. No, that's where it is. It's in the mind. It's in the creative intellect. It's the creation of ideas. That man, by changing, by understanding and discovering new principles of nature, mastering those, communicating those, practicing those, increases man's power to exist and the quality of existence. And man becomes, through the creative power of an intellect made in the image of God, man is able to do what no animal species in this universe known can do. Is actually change, in effect, his species nature, to come to a higher level of existence. And that's what these things mean. This progress means, up to the 14th century. Now, for example, some people say you learn from experience, that all their knowledge comes from experience. Well, they don't know much, do they? That's the condition. Let's take the case where I'd like to cite the case of Aristophanes. Aristophanes was a man who lived, he's originally from a part of Africa called Cyrenaica, which was largely Greek at that time. He'd gone to Athens during the 3rd century B.C. He was sort of a contemporary of Archimedes of Syracuse. He became a leading distinguished figure in the Academy of Athens, which had been founded by Plato. He was called then as a tutor to the royal family of the Greek, of course, the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, in Alexandria. He became the librarian of the famous Library of Alexandria, and he was a leading mathematician and scientist of his period. Now, one of the many things which Aristophanes is known for, and he made a great number of very important discoveries, one of the most important scientific thinkers in all history, was he made an estimate of the size of the Earth. Remember, keep your eye on the ball on this one. We're talking about creativity here, not just Aristophanes. He's just illustrating what Aristophanes measured the size of the Earth. Now, he was off. But if you take what he measured actually was the arc of a great circle from Alexandria to Rome. If we extrapolate what his measurement of the great circle was, we would come out with an Earth whose diameter at the poles would be about 50 miles off. Now, that's pretty good considering the fact that this was all done by line-of-sight observations, no telescopes, done by Egyptian and Greek methods, and that no man, until space exploration in the post-1945 period, had ever seen the curvature of the Earth. No one with their own senses could have proven directly, by direct sight, that the Earth was not flat. Not only did Aristophanes know that the Earth was curved, or sort of a semi-spheroid, but he was able to estimate the size of that spheroid within what, by accounting standards today, is a very precise calculation. Therefore, we do not know from experience We don't know from sense experience. An animal may know from sense experience, but not man. Man is of a different nature. Man has an intellect. Now, what did Aristophanes or anybody else who was observant his time know about the curvature of the earth? Well, they watched eclipses. And when you see an eclipse of the moon, you see this shape, this shadow, which tells you that the earth, which is interfering between the moon and the sun at that point, has a curvature. Now, if you take and draw some circles, and you take shadows and light signs, you can make a pretty good model. Even if you don't know trigonometry, you can get a pretty good estimate of what's going on there. And they did do a fair estimate also, by the way, of the distance from the moon to the earth. No one had ever seen that distance. That thing's just up there. You can't see the distance, can you? Any of you guys ever seen that distance? Unless you get up in a spaceship or see a picture of that, you don't see that distance. How do you know it's there? There, another way is if you take a star, and if you get a collaborator, say 100 miles north, and he gets out there and he does take a plumb bob, piece of a round stone on a string, tie it to a stick, and look at the line of that star, observe that star 100 different miles at the same time of day, and if you can do that properly, you will find that the declination, the angle of the stick relative to the line of the plumb bob changes. Same star, looking at it from Earth. And by those kinds of measurements and similar kinds of measurements, and by watching eclipses, you can come up, as Aristophanes did, with, first of all, with a proof that the Earth is a quasi-spheroid, and you can, by the same methods, without trigonometry, just using circular analog measurements, you can come up with a fair estimate of what the size of the Earth is. Remember, though the National Geographic magazine will deny it, they're liars, of course, like the New York Times, that Columbus found North America, or the islands off it, because he had a map. And the map he got, which was reasonably accurate, about as accurate as Aristophanes' map on the terms of the size of the Earth, there was no error. Able to do it. He also knew the map was right. It was wrong, actually. There was an error in the map because they had the islands of Japan somewhere in the middle of the Mississippi Valley. But that was because Venetians lied about the distance from Venice to Japan. It was part of their typical Venetian trick. But nonetheless, because they had studied the north and south currents in the Atlantic Ocean, they knew the curvature of the current, and they could estimate how far land was on the other side of the current. So with the aid of a map, Columbus knew where he was going, that land was there, and knew how long it would take to get there, approximately. And he was right. This was all done by intellectual methods. Now, you all remember that you were exposed to a school, and most of you had an education which, you think about it, you'll object to. Most of you were given a textbook or something equivalent. You were told you were supposed to learn to repeat after me, so to speak, what authorities of the past had discovered. And today you were prepared to pass a multiple-choice questionnaire, aren't you? Now, if you went to a good school, that wouldn't happen to you. In a good school, such as the one that Nicholas of Cusa attended as an adolescent, you would be given a text written hundreds or thousands of years ago, such as Aristophanes, concretely, Plato, and so forth. You would be given a text. You would read the text, and you say, well, what does this text mean? And the text would be a report on a fundamental discovery of principle by some gentleman. Gentlemen seem to do most of the reported discovering in those days. Hundreds or thousands of years before. And you as a student would relive the mental act of discovery which that original discoverer went through. What you would be doing with this kind, which is called a classical humanist method of education, unlike what's done in schools today, you would be reliving the act of discovery of the greatest known minds in all history. Now, if you do that for about 4 or 5 or 6 years as a good pre-secondary and secondary school education, after about 6 years of replicating some of the most crucial discoveries of principle made by the known greatest minds in all history, your mental powers are pretty well developed, aren't they? Now, even if you have a bad education, the way you learn something is not by learning to repeat after me. You learn by working it through. And when you work through ideas and discoveries, to repeat them, to say, can I believe this? Is it true? You get a sense of truth. And you also get a sense of the same thing that a classical humanist education provides you. Thus, what is happening through education and similar expressions in society, I'll get to one other case as a good example of this. The young child is transmitted to it, has transmitted to it, a replication of the great discovery, not ideas as something words you paste on a wall, but the act of discovering an idea, which is a real idea. The child relives some of the crucial discoveries of all mankind today. One of the most important discoveries that men and women relive as children is the discovery of language. Language is one of the great inventions of mankind. It's a great development. It has a history. We know from the great scholar Panini, the philologist who lived about the 5th century BC in India, who wrote of the Sanskrit language, and we know something about the dating of the Vedic origin of the Sanskrit language. We know that the Sanskrit language, perhaps 5,000 years ago, or in the Vedic form, between about 4,000 BC, when we can date the Vedic to before 4,000 BC in Central Asia by astronomical content, that this language is a highly developed language. As a language structure was one of those highly developed that ever existed on this planet. Already then. So even in the early days of pre-science, mankind had already made a number of inventions, of which language is the most important of this time, which the child today is actually reliving tens of thousands of years of development of human knowledge, of fundamental discoveries, in just learning a language. So yeah, that's why you have to give a child a little chance to learn language. Phil Graham, of course, you have to give a lot longer, but that's different. Now, let's take the case of music. How do you learn music? By learning how to read a score? No, you don't. You learn to perform music by reliving the experience and learning from composers. You actually relive the same thing. So what mankind does is mankind relives history of thousands of generations before, with emphasis on some of the most crucial contributions that are known to be contributions. That is it. What happens? Thus, in this way, mankind, I can tell you that I know Plato personally better than know most of the people I've shaken hands with. And he was dead over 2,000 years before I was born. Why? Because I know the inside of his mind. Because I have relived some of the most important moments in his mind. I have recreated, in a sense, in my own mind, some of the greatest moments of thought experience he had. Aristophanes, the discovery of Aristophanes, which any child can relearn. Same thing. We can demonstrate to children this discovery. We should. Good schools would do that. Therefore, what happens? We are now linked together. We cannot be separated by the grave. We are linked together across thousands of years into the past and thousands of years into the future. The entire human species is linked together. Through what? Through the commonality of those aspects of ourselves which are our true selves, which belong to this quality of creative intellect, which defines each of us in the living image of God. Now, what happens then if we take man and we keep over at least 95% or more of the human population? Overall history prior to the 15th century is doomed. If the intellectual life of society is limited to a top few, and in which most people have a very meager and very fragile kind of individual existence, impoverished. We have all these people. How many are being created? How many are participating in culture? How many are absorbing the knowledge from the past and transmitting it improved to the future, even intact to the future? A very small portion. What does society, ancient society, look like? These ancient societies. Well, more than 95% of all people live as virtual chattels. Because the development of society didn't permit it, and because under these conditions, they developed a form of society which is called generically oligarchical society. That was the term that was used in the 4th century BC in the negotiations between the Magi of the Middle East, who represented and controlled the Persian Empire from within, the Babylonian priesthood essentially, and the circles of Philip of Macedon. An agreement was struck through people like Socrates, who was the controller of Aristotle, and Philip of Macedon and the Persian Empire. And the agreement was that they would give Philip of Macedon, the king of Macedon, they would give him the entire Persian Empire west of the Halys River, that's a river in the middle of the Anatolian Peninsula, and the Euphrates. And the Achaemenid monarchy, the Persian emperor, would take all the land to the east, and they would set out together to conquer the whole world, with Philip taking it to the west and the Persian Achaemenid emperor to the east. And the agreement was based on, as Socrates and others put it, that this is conditional upon Philip committing his part of the empire to maintain in perpetuity the oligarchical model. Now, what's the oligarchical model? The oligarchical model means that, typified by Sparta. In Sparta, you had a communist oligarchy, literally communist. By the Lycurgan law, they had to share the same meals and all this. They're real communists, but they're also oligarchs. Reminds you of the old Soviet dictatorship, doesn't it, the nomenclature? But they would, for amusement, hunt down the slaves on whose labor they subsisted. These slaves were called helots. They were more numerous. And at night, young adolescent Spartan oligarchs would go out and hunt down a slave and torture him or perhaps kill him for amusement. And this was considered part of the conditioning of the life of the young oligarchs. That is oligarchical society. You have the image of that in Greek society in the pagan religion, the mythology of Olympus. You have a group of gods, Olympic gods, who play dirty tricks upon humanity. And that's why they call them gods, like Hollywood directors or something. Huh? Now, these, of course, in real life, these gods are not persons, they are families. You know, people die, but the families tend to go on. So the family takes the quality of being a deity. You have the number one deity, and you have all the other deities around it, then you have the semi-deities. Now, society, therefore, the oligarchical society is composed of, on the bottom, more than 95% live as serfs, slaves, or worse. Particularly if you're under the Aztecs. That's the worst, lowest form of society we know, one of them. And the greatest thing the Spaniards ever did was to destroy the Aztec government, which was killing, 18,000 hearts or ripped out living hearts in less than a 48-hour period in one ritual to inaugurate a temple. That's quite a culture for you. That's even worse than the Supreme Court Chief Justice, Rehnquist. I suppose some of these conservatives would love to do something like that, but they just haven't got the nerve to get up and try it yet. But don't worry, they'll get to it. Then on top, what do you have? You have less than 5% of the population is living above this state of oppression. What do they consist of? Well, at the top, you have these few families which are oligarchical. And in every culture we know, this tends to be the case. Underneath that, you have priesthood, military, clerks, merchants, and so forth, who function as lackeys of the oligarchical families who administer the society, the rule over the 95% or more of those who are subjected. That is barbarism. That is the Roman Empire in all its forms. That is Byzantium included. That is feudalism. That is the condition of man. Yes, there were periods where feudalism would have relatively less oppressive conditions for the serfs and so forth, but nonetheless, that was the condition. Now, in this process, there develops an oligarchy which does not find its interest to promote the development of society, but believes its interest is to loot society. And as far back as we know in history, back 6,000 years on this one, in Mesopotamia, for example, the oligarchy practiced usury. That is straight looting, wealth produced by other people by some kind of political condition. And many of these societies collapsed, and usually did collapse as a result not of anything as much as the effects of usury. For example, in Mesopotamia, from the time of the Sumerians, Sumerians were not Semitic people, they were people who came from India, as largely. They were called the black-headed people. They were they were a black-skinned culture, probably the Indians of that particular, the Harappan type of culture, the colony of Harappa, because civilization didn't begin in Mesopotamia. That was a colony. And then they colonized Semites. And when the Sumerians collapsed because of this problem, the Semites took over and formed the Akkadian Semitic system in southern Mesopotamia, which led to the succession of Mesopotamian society. Now, the characteristic of this society, which emerged as based on management of water, irrigated patches, and the way the society functioned was on a system of bow tenure. This system of bow tenure continued into relatively modern times. You find something like that under the Caliph Harun al-Rashid and al-Mamun before them, in which the peasant held a property, which is his property, which he maintained and so forth. And he had a couple of obligations. One obligation was he had to bring his bow to battle under certain conditions when the nation was threatened, and that was therefore what was known as, described as, bow tenure. Now, when somebody came along and said, in collecting taxes from these peasants, and instead of collecting taxes in kind, began to collect taxes in money, then when the peasants couldn't get the money, rather than the kind, to pay the taxes, or the taxes became excessive, then they would take the land from the peasant, throw the peasant off the land, and use hired labor or slaves to work the land. As a result of these changes introduced by usury, the system collapsed repeatedly, and that was the characteristic of Mesopotamia. As a matter of fact, the caliphate was collapsed by the same thing. The caliphate introduced the tolerance for usury in tax collection. That is, you had these tax farmers who would buy the right to collect taxes from the state. They would pay the king, the caliph, a certain amount of money for the right to collect the taxes. Then they would go out and get what they could get, squeeze, in turn for this tax farming privilege. And it was this tax farming which destroyed the caliphate. What they did is these tax farmers brought in Seljuk Turks from an area which is now in Iran. They brought them in as enforcers, like mafia bosses, muscle men, to collect the taxes. And this, gradually, the caliphate was taken over by the Seljuks, who one night said, look, we got the muscle, the mafia's taken over. And that was the fall of the caliphate, and how it fell. But this kind of system, and this was the characteristic of mankind's condition. Even where you had relatively enlightened states, the persistence of this institution called an oligarchy, or oligarchism, would intervene, and you'd have the same old crap all over again in these typical dynastic cycles, which are the history of China, which are the history of the subcontinent, which are the history of the Middle East, which are the, well, Africa's got another special case of history of this sort of thing, but the history of Europe. And that's what mankind was like up until this revolution between 1439 and 1483. Because the state, even though Moses and Christianity taught that the individual, and you're not a Christian if you don't believe it. Don't give me this other stuff about faith or reading the Bible or something. If you do not understand what it means to say that man is created in the image of God by virtue of this creative power of intellect and nothing else, then you don't understand the first thing about Moses, the first thing about Christianity. That's what it's all about. But this principle, the Christian principle, the Mosaic principle, that the individual is created in the image of God, was not made a part of statecraft. Now, what's the significance of this? If I have less than 5% of the population, if a small intelligentsia within 5% of the population is the only part of the whole people which is developing ideas, changing practice, and if the other rest are really not allowed or developed to be able to do that, what's your rate of progress? Yes, you have progress because people are, even if they're oppressed, they still have this creative power of intellect. It may be suppressed and brutalized and crippled and impaired. But in the better moments, you find that people just naturally tend to create. That's what people are like. They naturally tend to think that other human beings are human beings, even though they forget that once in a while. And so there was progress. So man did come from an ape-like condition, even under these terrible conditions, to reach a population on a higher level of 250 to 300 million people in the 14th century. But still, the human condition was abysmal, not acceptable. Not acceptable to me, shouldn't be acceptable to you. What happened is the state said, following the ideas which were enunciated at the Council of Florence, the state of Louis XI, who was actually directly influenced by the Council of Florence and tied to those institutions and tied to the same brotherhood of the common life which had educated Nicholas of Cusa. As a matter of fact, the brotherhood of the common life established schools in France for Louis XI as part of the program of introducing a process of general education along the principles of the brotherhood of the common life, which used to go out and take poor boys, bright poor boys, take them in their adolescent years, take them off and give them this classical humanist education and turn a great number of them into geniuses, which is what universal education ought to be. Take poor boys, poor girls, poor families, take them off and give them a classical humanist educational experience and turn as many as possible into geniuses. Well, that's what they started to do. So there was, within the 20-odd years of the reign of Louis XI, the per capita income of France increased about doubled, or close to that. This became a source of inspiration, the success, and envy in Isabella, Spain, for example, where there were efforts to create a united Spain on the basis of the model of what had been done in France. The Erasmians, the Oratorians, generically, in England, as the Friends of Erasmus in England, under the kingdom of Tudor Henry VII, the father of that crazy sex maniac, Henry VIII, actually made an attempt to introduce a modern nation state of that Commonwealth form into England. Throughout Europe, this new movement called the Commonwealth movement, characterized by the emergence of cameralism and other things, and the rapid development of science, the development of the rate of discovery of fundamental principles of nature, and art since this Renaissance is greater at a greater rate than any time in history, up until about 1964 or so forth, when things began to go downhill with the counterculture and things around here. So that is a result of the participation through the fostering of public sanitation, through the states taking responsibility for the general welfare of every citizen, through the citizen's sense of obligation to contribute to the state for the purpose of enabling the state to take care and promote everybody's life. The fostering of scientific and technological progress, the fostering of a more generalized education and culture and literature, the use of the printed word. These communications increase the participation of the society in the process of progress and increase the quality of intellectual life of the individual, so the individual was assimilating more knowledge, was nurturing his or her creative powers at a greater rate, and was able to assimilate and contribute to mankind at a greater rate. So if you have 50% of the population as opposed to less than 5 contributing to progress, the rate of progress is higher, isn't it? And it all is based on recognizing the nature of the human individual as in the image of God by virtue of this creative power of intellect. The fostering of that power through a classical humanist method of development of the mind, the creation of the opportunities of the young person being so educated to express that increased power in a suitable form of employment and social life. These are the primary concerns, moment to moment, of any good society, as expressed or reflected in the General Welfare Clause in the preamble of the U.S. Federal Constitution. And that's what has happened. Now, on the other side, the oligarchy didn't like it. Here you have this mass of people, and someone says they're no longer going to be servants, slaves, and whatnot. These are now going to be free, maybe gradually, but as fast as we're able to do that. We're going to free man from this condition of beast-like toil and similar conditions. We are going to recognize the dignity of every person as in the image of God, every individual person. And that's the kind of society we're going to develop. That was the conscious principle of Louis XI, the conscious principle of the Commonwealth faction. This is what Rabelais, who's an Oratorian, is talking about with his Gargantua and Pantagruel. This is the issue which is raised by Cervantes in dealing with this crazy old lunatic Don Quixote and this typical conservative voter Sancho Panza, who cannot get his lusts above his waistline, up to his head. They visit the head occasionally, but they don't like it there. They go back to the below the waistline where they're happy. And the man is so concerned with his own passions, his own pettiness, his own appetites, his own practical experience, his own sense experience, that he can't get his head working. And that's a very poor quality of citizen. The main purpose, of course, of this whole thing is to make people unstupid. We may not succeed with Phil Graham, but we can try with other cases which are more hopeful. So that's what this is about. So the oligarchy didn't like it. For example, let's take Lord William Rees-Mogg, a crazy old fat fascist, the godfather of Newt Gingrich, or the devil father, perhaps, if we prefer. Lord William Rees-Mogg has said recently and repeatedly, has enunciated the purposes of the Mont Pelerin Society, a fascist organization created by British intelligence using a European conservative revolution, i.e. fascist, Friedrich von Hayek, who called fascism freedom. And they established the Mont Pelerin Society in the United States, among elsewhere, other places. And the Mont Pelerin Society, like a mother sow, has thrown a bunch of piglets. And these piglets are all sucking at her dugs. like the Heritage Foundation, the National Taxpayers Union, this sort of thing. They're all, as you'll see, all part of this business. And these people have for years been creating the ideas of free trade. Milton Friedman is one of these fascists, and so forth. And they've been gradually recruiting these déclassés, or these middle-class people who want to be king, and others, have been recruiting them to this conservative idea, which some of you might call racist, and other things like that, other unpleasant names, but it's all true, of course. But there's an essence to this matter. And now we have these guys who got elected to the Congress when people weren't watching. And we were watching in Virginia. We didn't let Ollie North get in there. And you see, Virginia is much the better for that today, as you see the recent legislative votes. People got their courage back in Virginia. They voted this stuff down, which they're not doing yet in Washington. So they got these poor fellows elected. They didn't know what they were doing, by the Mont Pelerin Mafia. They took them up to the Heritage Foundation's retreat. They brainwashed them, got them chanting and hyperventilating and wearing buttons and reciting slogans. And by the time they became glassy-eyed, they marched him down, following Rush Limbaugh and bumping his knuckles along the street as he went. That's the Longworth building, and they put him in the Congress, and now they've been voting this crazy stuff ever since. These guys are authentic fascists, in the real sense, as will be clear, I think, by the end of these 4 sessions, what that is. But Rees-Mogg is the godfather. He is the exponent. He represents that part of the British intelligence service which is running the dirty operations against President Clinton, who's running all these Bush League, Star Bar, whatever, nonsense characters doing that sort of thing. These are the people who are trying to turn back the clock of history to feudalism. And Rees-Mogg has said repeatedly that he intends to go a little bit further than feudalism. He said that only 5% of the population should be educated. The rest should be hewers of wood and drawers of water, except we're now into the 3rd wave, where you don't get food anymore, you get to eat software. And that means, obviously, if you do that, that's what these guys are. If you do that, if you do what these fellows propose, if you do what Prince Philip proposes, if you do what these fellows propose, then what will happen? You will find that the increase of potential population density, which we have seen in the past 550 years on this planet, the increase from 250 to 300 million people to more than 5+. And we could, if we'd used the technology we had at the end of the 60s, we could sustain about 25 billion people on this planet in a life which is as comfortable as so-called middle-class income back in the late 1960s. We had the technology. We've thrown a good deal of it away since then. So we had that kind of a population potential. But if we reverse this trend, if we eliminate science and technology, if we allow these ecology nuts to continue their rampage, if you can't tell what if you can't tell what your wife's sex is going to be 2 days from now, that kind of a society, then what's going to happen to you is we're going to go back to the conditions before the Renaissance. And you're going to have a human race, uneducated, unemployed, a Roman-type proletariat or worse, dying of famine, disease, and demoralization and insanity, a kind of mass social dementia which can kill. And we find the human population in the period of a couple of generations will collapse from over 5 billion to less than 500 million. That collapse is the worst nightmare ever imagined on this planet. That's what these guys are doing. Now, they may not think that through. Someone like Rees-Mogg does. He wants to go back to a pre-feudal barbaric paradise or something of that sort. And so do many of these people. But someone like Gingrich and so forth is an opportunist. Others who are in this conservative revolution are driven not by reason but by rage. They're bitter, they're mad, they're crazy. They have all kinds of ideal beliefs. Make no sense, but they believe them. And if the world doesn't conform to that, they're going to kill the world and punish it for not not doing the way they want it to do. They're like a terrorist. So that's what these guys are. They want to turn back the clock to eliminate this kind of society in which every person is recognized as having the right of being a person in the image of God. They want to eliminate those forms of education, those forms of scientific and technological progress, which enable a person to live in a manner more in keeping with a creature in the image of God. Developing the creative power of intellect, which is that which is in the image of God. Utilizing that developed creative power for some good purpose. Transmitting ideas of value from one generation to the next. Living the kind of life with relations with people around them which fits that. They don't want that. They wish to destroy it. Now we live in a world also which is insane. We live in virtual reality. Television set, virtual reality. People, back in the 1970s, we shut down technological progress. We eliminated a monetary system which was geared to the profitability and rate of growth of industrial and agricultural production. We created a speculative form of floating exchange rate international monetary system. We went to insanity with an arbitrary oil price rise, orchestrated in part by British intelligence using Henry Kissinger as part of the agency for doing that in the middle of the 1970s. We created petrodollar bonds. We created then insanity in the form of Paul Volcker. Paul Volcker ran in the spring of 1979 for Carter's nomination of him to be Federal Reserve Chairman. What he ran on, and he said so explicitly on the campaign trail in England, that he was committed to the option of controlled disintegration of the world economy. And he did it. He, in October 1979, right after Carter had put him in the Federal Reserve Chairman, he raised the interest rates in a way which, up to 18% or even higher, which destroyed much of the structure of the U.S. economy between October of 1979 and spring of 1983. He destroyed the savings and loan banks. Then in 1982, led by the President of the Senate, George Bush, we went through another round of financial deregulation, which allowed George Bush's friends, the thieves, to loot the savings and loan banks, which are no longer viable. We had a great rip-off. Then we had a rip-off of your pension funds. It's called junk bonds. We passed a law, blessed by George Bush, the President of the Senate, which said that a trustee manager had to invest in the highest interest rate yields, objective lending. Now, junk bonds, which are worthless, or relatively worthless, had a higher yield than secure, lower risk paper. Therefore, under that pretext, you would have George Bush's friends go to the Attorney General of the state of Minnesota, who was a trustee, or someone similar in another part of the country, and say, you got to buy some junk bonds. Well, I don't think they're worth much. Yeah, but you have to buy them by law. So we're going to take your state teachers' pension fund, and you're going to swap some of those equities you have in there for about $300 million worth of junk bonds. This has happened all over the country. Pension funds, all kinds of things have been looted where a worthless paper has been substituted for that. About the time George Bush was elected president with the R.J. Reynolds Nabisco swindle, the junk bond racket had about run out of steam. They were scraping the bottom and the sides of the barrel and the pigs around it to get enough fat to get that deal through. And that about exhausted. Then they came up with an even more wild business. Derivatives. Derivatives of derivatives. And derivatives of derivatives of derivatives. That As a result is that you have a world bubble, financial bubble, in the hundreds of trillions of dollars nominal value, turnover. How large it is, nobody knows because nobody keeps records. But they know it's much bigger than, much larger than any record indicates. This is many times the total annual gross value added of the entire world economy. This bubble exists, depends upon a stream of real income taken out of your salary, your food, your pension, your taxes, and so forth. The greatest single problem with the budget is that Graham-Rudman and so forth cut the taxes and also helped increase the debt. They're trying to cut things that had nothing to do with the growth of debt. They should cut out Phil Graham. They might save a lot of money that way. He did more to increase the debt than anybody did. He's the one thing in the budget we can't afford. So what happens is now financial aggregates are growing. But financial aggregates grow by shrinking the real economy. Production, infrastructure, food, incomes of households. That's the real economy. That's shrinking per capita, per household, and per square kilometer of land area. Whereas, on the other hand, the financial aggregates, the financial bubble, is growing. Just like a cancer growing at the expense of the healthy tissue in a person. Unless you cut the cancer out, the person's going to die. What happens is people say, but the economy is growing. What's growing? The cancer, you damn fool. It's growing. Financial aggregates are increasing. Incomes are up. What incomes? And what do they want to do? They want to cut the capital gains tax rate on this kind of phony money income, which will make it even worse, to subsidize it. But the whole society is now living. Look at Orange County, but Orange County is only a blip. It's all over the country. Government agencies, private agencies, everybody's into this crazy gambling mania. It's like the tulip mania in Holland back in the 17th century, or the South Sea Island bubble, or the Mississippi bubble back in the 18th century. Mania, absolute lunacy, grips the most powerful financial and related interests and political interests in this country. They're all getting rich on hot air. And they have to bleed the real economy down another notch every week in order to subsidize the continuation of this great gambling game. It's like the person takes his whole paycheck and he goes off and he gambles every week with it before he gets home. And he gambles more than his paycheck, and he goes into hock to keep his gambling habit going. And he has to squeeze more and more out of this. He has to sell this, sell his daughter into slavery, sell his this and sell that to keep the gambling habit going. And that's what's happening to the United States. What do the people in this country do? They watch television. What's on television? Do you ever watch it? What's there? It's virtual reality. It has no correspondence to reality. There's no drama. There are thrills, but no drama. Soap opera is more disgusting than the sex and blood business. It's slimier. The whole country is absorbed with entertainment, with this video insanity. People are living in virtual reality. And they say, what do you say? What's happening? I heard. Where? On television. I read it in the newspaper. Unless we say that's not true. Oh, no, you're wrong. All of my friends agree with me. Where do they get their information? The same place I did. But they're right. The majority is right, you know. No, the problem is the majority is insane. The problem is that people who are in the highest levels of power are insane. Take the entire national establishment of France. On the bottom level of France, from the mayors on down, you will find the majority of the population of France is still sane. But you go to the higher levels, the elites, the bankers, the big politicians of all the parties, the influentials, much of the press, so forth. The entire French establishment, the elite, are decadent beyond belief. They're as decadent as the worst in the time of Napoleon III and afterward. They're as decadent as the Fourth Republic, or worse. They don't function. Britain, the ruling class, is disgusting. The condition of the British royal family is only a marker, an expression for the condition of the entire British ruling class. The British people have almost, in many parts of Britain, have lost the capacity for human speech. They have been so degraded and ground down by the economic and related conditions which were imposed upon that country by Margaret Thatcher and her policies. All throughout the world, the paucity of quality of thinking among the leading circles is the same. And what's the common feature? It's just like the Supreme Court, Supreme Chief Justice saying that just because a man has been shown to be innocent does not mean we should not continue with the execution. He's saying that the procedures of law, whether they are truthful or not, will be followed. Procedure. Whereas in a sane society we develop procedures, we develop scientific techniques in order to help us discover the truth. Now we've gotten to a situation where procedure, entertainment, mythology, legend are now counterposed against the truth. Truth no longer has authority. Procedure. This is just like the Nazi period. They called it Gleichschaltung, the sameness, the same track. People are going on the same track, but in a world of illusion, with slogans which are worthless, with ideas which are worse than worthless. And that's what's happening to us. And that's what the oligarchy has done. All right, let's go on with this. Now let's take on this other side and just look now at some of these. No, keep that thing on. That's right. No, okay. All right, this is, what year is this? We want the first one. What? Okay, they're fine, good. That's it. That's right, all right, fine. Okay, just go through this. These are the periods. You can see the date. We're taking it from Sumer, approximately, in the Mesopotamia, up to about 1000 BC. Okay, next one. Ancient Greece. Now see the same thing. What in this case and in the previous one? You see there is a characteristic of ancient society. There is a rise to a peak in population, and you will see over there on the other comparative chart, you will see that also there's a correspondence with energy flux or population density and with life expectancy. And, all right. It rises to a peak, and then there's a decline, more or less precipitous. Next one. Again, China. This is, again, typical China. This is yin-yang in reality. That's what it is. Okay, next one. I guess Rome now. Again, 200 AD, the high point of population in the ancient Roman Empire. Declining, and this, of course, is, again, Byzantium is pretty sunk. You see the great decline. This period here, from 300 to 600, is called the Dark Age of the Roman Empire. The decline, cannibalism, all kinds of horror shows introduced in the collapse of Rome, but the Rome which collapsed of its own internal purposes. Next one. China again. Again, you see the same thing. China came out of a dark age, great rise in population, and then a collapse into the modern times. Again, next. Again, the Caliphate. Right? All right, the Caliphate, you see the characteristics of the rise. You see the impact of actually the great contributions in the Caliphate were Al-Mamun and Harun al-Rashid, which were earlier than this period. But they set in, like their own Renaissance, they set in motion in the Caliphate the gathering of knowledge, the ingathering of knowledge into all the libraries, the setting up of this great system of education, which unfortunately was a limited number of people. But nonetheless, the benefits of that resulted after this period in a continued spread of technology and growth of the population, which continued until about 1000, which is the period approximately the beginning of the Crusades, which never had any good purpose. They had an internal European purpose. But at that point, then with that and with the descent into the Mongol invasion, which came later, then you have the collapse of the caliphate as a whole throughout Africa and so forth, Northern Africa. Okay, next. Now you see, in Charlemagne's impact is about 800 A.D. This is his contemporary, essentially, with Harun al-Rashid. As a matter of fact, they had correspondence and did some trade deals and other deals together. You see the slow rise of Europe. It's a great period of troubles at about 1000 to 1100 A.D. There are many details of this, but look at from about 1100 A.D., the rise to about 1300. Now, actually, at that point, 1300, the conditions are collapsing. They've been collapsing essentially from about 1250 A.D., the political conditions. But nonetheless, the inertia of the benefits which were already in place in Europe prior to 1250 were still being felt until the collapse set in as reflected in population, hitting at about the beginning of the 14th century. Now, this is the period at which the debt is beginning to peak, the so-called Lombard debt of the Venetians. And that leads into, the straight line is not accurate, as a point of fact, in Europe, about 1/3 of the total population, or 1/2 of the population of Europe vanished during the course of the 14th century. And during a period of the middle of the 14th century, slightly later, about 1/3 of the population then existing was wiped out at that time. The Black Death was part of that process. And this leads up to this period. Now the next. All right. The important thing here is to see the recovery. There was a mini renaissance from the beginning of the 15th century, which reflected developments typified by the founding and influence of the Brotherhood of the Common Life, teaching order, and other things, which produced the geniuses typified by Nicholas Acusa, who combined together to introduce the revolution which overtook Europe between 1439 and 1483, the so-called Golden Renaissance. And this already began progress, but again, these are estimates, and therefore the bumps and dents and so forth in the curve are not shown. But the important things to note is that the rate of increase, and now on this side show the other chart, the first one, which is number 3 on that side. All right. The point here is that the rate of increase of potential population density, partly as a result of increase in life expectancy, but also for other reasons, is hyperbolic from the middle of the 15th century on. That this was transmitted throughout the world. Now, the issue is this. This is not the whole story. In 1440, what happened? In 1440, between 1440 and 1463, 64, the two movements were set into operation. The first was an ecumenical Council of Florence, of which we've written much and spoken much. This was ecumenical. The Eastern and Western churches at the top were brought together in ecumenical fraternity, healing the breach on the basis of the so-called filiation, the filioque. Now, the basis for the filioque, as opposed to the anti-filioque tendencies in Christianity, and anti-filioque tendencies in Christianity are all Gnostic, is that man is created in the image of God. That is the cornerstone of Christianity in particular. And the filioque is an expression of that. And thus, this conception we see in Cousa's treatment of the concepts of the Imago Dei and Capax Dei together reflect that. So, but the second phase was expressed by Cusa's De Pace Fide, which is an ecumenical approach to the problems of religion, especially involving the three monotheistic or Mosaic religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. On the basis essentially of the commonality of the principle of God, or as Plato would say, the unhypothesized God, and on the basis of the principles which are associated with the notion of man as being created in the image of God, or made in the image of God. So this was a great movement. On the other side, the oligarchy was opposed to both of these movements. In 1440, the Venetian oligarchy took the leadership in organizing, together with the Osmanian dynasty and other forces, in organizing to destroy the work of the Council of Florence. And the same forces worked to destroy the revolution organized in France around the monarchy and by the monarch, Louis XI. France became powerful, and the result of France's power, which was a result of the Renaissance in France, the Commonwealth change in France, the French forces united with the Vatican and others to destroy Venice, which was the menace to all this progress, this civilization, the menace to humanity. This was the heart of the oligarchy. And this came in 1508 to 1510. It's called the League of Cambrai. In 1509, the League of Cambrai, involving the papacy, France, and other forces, had defeated Venice and were prepared to deliver the crushing blow. The Venetians survived by organizing some of the forces in the League of Cambrai to make war against France in alliance with Venice. And that began the problems directly which characterize modern civilization today. The Venetians moved to split Britain off from England off from its alliance with Spain and with France, which they did with a famous operation with that sex maniac Henry VIII. They did use measures also to split Spain from France, beginning immediately with the breakup of the League of Cambrai. So they set the allies who'd been allies for this revolution against each other. And by setting their enemies against each other, Venice was able to find maneuvering room. Then in 1582, a new movement developed in Venice with the victory of a faction led by a professed atheist by the name of Paolo Sarpi, who was the leader of this majority faction of Venetians. And now the Venetians had created the Reformation in order to split Europe in two. They created that, they created Martin Luther and these kinds of things directly, by direct intervention. They then created, in their own way, the Counter-Reformation in order to keep Northern Europe, nominally Protestant, in war against Southern Europe, nominally Catholic, though there were all kinds of things on both sides. They had France and England and Spain mutually at each other's throats. Northern Europe against Southern Europe. And that's the way this tiny island area, Venice, this maritime peninsula power, was able to manipulate all of Europe. Paolo Sarpi introduced a change. Paolo Sarpi said, despite the fact that we've had these successes, we cannot defeat this Renaissance simply by attacking it with reactionary methods from the outside. What we have to do is we have to invade the governments, take over the governments of these nations. We have to invade the institutions of science and so forth and culture, and by corrupting the institutions of science, culture, and government, we are going to be able to control this phenomenon of the modern nation state, and so forth. And that's what they did. That Paolo Sappi created Galileo against Kepler. The fraud Galileo against Kepler. The Sappi created Francis Bacon. Sappi created the monarchy of James I of England. Sappi created Robert Flood, another anti-Kepler character. Out of this, the same forces created René Descartes. They created in France a force called the Fronde in 17th century France. They later created the physiocrats. They created Adam Smith. They created Jeremy Bentham. They created Lord Shelburne. They created the British monarchy in 1714. They created the British Empire. They concentrated their forces in the British, around the British and Dutch monarchies, who were sort of like body snatchers from outer space, took over the premises. That was that kind of operation. These are Venetians, not from outer space, but from Venice. And they built up the Anglo-Dutch monarchy and the Habsburg monarchy in the south as the centers of their power. They played one against the other. They organized wars among nations in Europe. They set out to destroy France, which they finally succeeded in breaking France with the aid of Napoleon in 1814. They broke Europe completely in the Triple Entente at the beginning of this century. And since the Treaty of Versailles, the world has been dominated by this international oligarchy, largely financier oligarchies, but including appendages like the Lord Rees-Moggs, who are not just British. They are not an autochthonous secretion of the British Isles. They come from all parts of the world, including Hong Kong gangsters, who are also in the inner club of the oligarchy. About 5,000 of them, if you want to know how many there are, that run the empire. And they have this mushroom, this fungus growth called the monarchy in the middle, which is their key institution. And the entire world is run and manipulated by this force. We had, in this century, since the assassination of McKinley, we've had 3 presidents of the United States who are not totally buffaloed by, or nearly totally buffaloed, by this British monarchy. Every other president has been essentially pro-British and has aided our subjugation to the British monarchy's whims. The 3 presidents are Franklin Roosevelt, not the best man in the world, but he knew what an American was, which most other presidents did not know. Hoover was not an American. Coolidge wasn't an American. Woodrow Wilson was a Ku Klux Klan founder from the White House itself. He officially launched the campaign for mass recruiting to the Ku Klux Klan in 1913, 1914 with a film, endorsement of the film, which was called The Klansman then. They changed it to The Birth of a Nation. And that gave you Hollywood. And Hollywood went downhill from there on. Teddy Roosevelt was not an American. He was implicitly a traitor, as was Wilson, so forth. Truman didn't know what time it was. President Eisenhower, however, had a couple of good points, but not all of them. Kennedy was the second one. He wasn't a perfect man, but Kennedy represented a policy course for the United States which was independent of British control, and that got him killed. The third president who's been independent somewhat and bucked the British has been the present one, Clinton, and you see what kind of trouble he gets as a result of that. They treat him almost like he was me. So the fight we have against the Lord Rees-Moggs, the Prince Phillips, that mushroom called the Queen, and these kinds of things, and the Gingriches, and knuckle-dragger Bush League Limbaugh, and these creeps, it's all the same fight. These are like Nazis without swastika brassards, who, like the Nazis of old, were deployed by the British royal family, the original Nazis, Hitler, by George Bush's daddy, by Averell Harriman, the great liberal, the man who didn't know the difference between right and wrong. That's why it was called liberal. To destroy the tradition of the Renaissance, to destroy the conception of a society which is trying to develop itself to meet the challenge of treating every human being as a creature made in the image of God, by virtue of creative powers of intellect, to organize society according to a general welfare principle which is approximated by the preamble of our Constitution, to uplift every individual by culture, education, to develop their potentialities which are in the image of God, and to provide for them opportunities to live a life expressing those qualities themselves, which are the developed qualities which make them in the image of God. That is what the fight is about. That is what all human history is about, which this fight is merely a more recent phase. Thus, European civilization has had a double quality. On the one side, we have contributed to the world a greater methods for a greater increase in not only the potential population density of the population, but also a higher standard of existence for mankind than has ever existed generally on this planet before this time. Unfortunately, because of the success of the ventures of Paolo Sarpi, and because of the breakup of the alliance at a critical point in the League of Cambrai in 1510, as a result of these catastrophes, we have our great civilization, our great gift to mankind, has been corrupted by a parasite, an oligarchical parasite, which sits like a brain parasite, sucking the juices out of the system and utilizing this power which this system has, European civilization, in order to loot and dominate the world. And thus, the way civilization has affected the planet as a whole is people throughout the world, in Ibero-America, for example, where they had a horrible condition of life before the Spaniards and Portuguese. The people of this area were uplifted by the arrival of European civilization. Getting rid of the Aztecs is a good example of that. Africa, well, Africa has not been much improved in any respect. Asia. These parts of the world, by their contact with modern European civilization, have had a taste of what is possible. Up until about 1966, it was still generally believed that people in the developing countries, we call them today, could hope that having tasted what is possible, they would have a right to get to the table too and enjoy it. Since then, things have gone backward, gone reverse. But nonetheless, despite this duality, in which this bunch of parasites has taken the power of this civilization and used it for evil, the civilization has nonetheless communicated to humanity in general the possibilities for a better life. Now this civilization is doomed in its present form. We have come in the coming 2 years to the end of the possibility of continuing this arrangement. Either the parasite is destroyed by us, or this civilization will go down into a dark age. And what we have is a weak reed, an American president and a few others, which are willing, up to a point, to conduct part of that fight. And that's the point from which we start. We're not going to win that basis, but that's a plus. And during the next 2 years, in our fight against the conservative revolution, we're not fighting against this stupid Phil Graham, who walks around strutting and squawking like a goose in heat. That is a problem. Newt Gingrich, you can buy him. About $40 million. It was the last price I heard. He's not serious. Rush Limbaugh, this perennial ex-husband, he's not that important. He's just a knuckle-dragger. These people individually are nothing. They're empty heads. They're brainwashed. They got that glassy expression in their eye. They're hyperventilated. They're not to be taken seriously. They're a mob. That's what the problem is. They're a lynch mob, a Ku Klux Klan mob, if you choose. But what we're fighting against them, in mobilizing the American people to understand that this is their enemy, the enemy of more than 80% of the American people, if they only wake up and find out about it. We'll tell them. We're going to tell them about that. In fighting against them, we're not fighting against them like a different faction or a competitor. We're fighting because they are the dupes, they are the hired or duped lynch mob of the Rees-Moggs and the Pence Phillips of the world, who are out to destroy the possibility that we might reverse the course of oligarchism and liberate the revolution that was made over 500 years ago, and liberate it to bring forth on this planet not paradise, but to continue the revolution which uplifts the oppressed of the world from the condition of being oppressed to being participants in a process which engages every human being as a person created in the image of God, a person who should be educated and developed to the fullest of that potential, who should be given the opportunity to express with the life they have the use of that potential to some beneficial purpose and the enjoyment of doing so. Thank you.
Before we begin our question and answer period, we have some greetings from the Nation of Islam and Dr. Ali Muhammad.
In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful, let me offer to you this morning the greetings of peace, as we say it in the Arabic, Assalamu alaikum. And let me say right off the bat that I wish I wasn't here, because it is actually Minister Louis Farrakhan who was invited to be standing here addressing this assembly this morning. And it is only because of his pressing schedule that he is not here. We're trying to figure out how $250 is adequate payment for an assassination plot. I mean, I know life has gotten pretty cheap nowadays. But actually, Minister Farrakhan is engaged in the last-minute details of his message, which will be delivered in Chicago next Sunday at our annual Savior's Day convention. There's about 4 days of activities, but his public address is next Sunday, and maybe some of you would be able to attend. But at that time, he intends to, in his words, go for broke. He wants to, as the Quran teaches, hurl truth at falsehood till he makes truth knock falsehood's brains out. And that's an important concept to understand, that evil doesn't just happen. There are evil brains in the heads of evil people who make it happen. The first time I ever met Mr. LaRouche in person, and I asked him about his prison experience, his answer was a little bit peculiar to me at the time. He says, well, you know, that's the price that you have to pay when you oppose evil. And he went on to say that that is what life is really all about for us today, is that we must oppose evil anywhere in the world where we find it. So next Sunday, Minister Farrakhan's subject will deal with the Internal Revenue Service, the FBI, the ADL, and of course, our friends at the Federal Reserve Bank. Also, I think significantly next week, there will be the release of Minister Farrakhan's music video. He's an accomplished violinist, and he has done the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto. So we hope that that will be released for worldwide distribution next week. And currently he's working on the Beethoven Violin Concerto for the future. Now, the point of the activity next weekend is to press forward with a progressive agenda, which includes a class action suit demanding that secret government files be opened, because innocent people are being attacked and they're being scandalized and even imprisoned because there apparently is a group that constitute a secret government that have the authority to hold certain information to themselves away from the American people, and then use that as to their advantage to advance their evil agenda. And so one of the things that we must do in the coming year is mobilize the population of this country to awaken them to the fact that this sorry state of affairs exists and that they should join in opposition to such secrecy by government officials and agencies. Now, I have from Minister Farrakhan a message that I will read and then follow that with just a few other comments. He writes, "It is a great honor and privilege for me to have these few words to say through my national spokesman to this august body of brilliant men and women who believe and follow the guidance of Mr. Lyndon LaRouche. We are fellow sufferers under a system that has pitted one group against another so that common cause will never develop, that we might in unity produce a necessary change within the society, a change beneficial not to one group or another, but a change that is beneficial to us all. In the past, this august body of men and women saw the Nation of Islam as a group who wanted to see or help to bring about the overthrow of the government of the United States by means of violent revolution. If the government of the United States is built on truth and righteousness, then there is no power that can overthrow it. However, if falsehood, deceit, and treachery are at the root, then truth will overthrow falsehood, deceit, and injustice. The founding fathers of this nation had a vision that was based upon their view of the history of the failure of European nations, governments, and systems in its attempt to serve the people or to serve its own greed and lust. The founding fathers wanted to draft a constitution and build a society that would protect the citizens of America from those evils that brought about the fall of her European sister nations. Something has happened contrary to their desire, and now the nation is on a self-destructive course. Although the founding fathers expressed a superior morality and built this nation on immutable laws and principles, their vision did not include the slaves, Native Americans, or the darker people of the earth who one day would populate this country. The vision of the Founding Fathers was flawed in that it was exclusive of the darker people. Now, America is challenged to either include the total populace of the nation in the promise of it or admit its hypocrisy and let the darker people go to build and develop an existence for themselves. Presently, the United States of America is suffering from gross mismanagement of her people, her wealth, and her gifts. America can be saved, but the question is, who will save her? All the voices of true patriots who rise up to point out a better way are falsely accused, maligned, imprisoned, and even put to death for the sake of the ideas which they represent. Such a one, I believe, is Lyndon LaRouche. We, as members of the Nation of Islam, believe that only a return to Allah and those principles of the Christ can save this nation from total disaster. The Christ represents spiritual principles that can unite all of America's people. The Christ represents moral principles that would cause us, if these principles were followed, not to infringe upon the rights and privileges of others. The Christ represents social principles that would cause America's people to interact with each other in a way that would produce not just limited progress, but eternal progress. The Christ represents economic principles that, if followed, would give to each human being according to his or her needs and develop the natural resources of this nation and the earth in a way that would give a healthy living standard to the people while protecting the environment. These Christ principles, if followed, would make America the greatest nation in history and in the world, and if successful, would be the foundation of the kingdom of God on earth. The Nation of Islam has been greatly misunderstood and in many cases purposely misrepresented. By the grace of Allah, we will do our utmost to represent the teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, which we believe contains light, life, power, and all of the Christ principles, not only for the lost black people, but also for the lost humanity of the world who have lost their way to true peace, freedom, justice, and equality. Our thanks to Mr. Lyndon LaRouche and his organization for inviting me to attend this gathering, and my thanks to you for hearing my friend, brother, companion, and national spokesman who will also express his comments, Minister Abdul Alim Muhammad, Minister of Health for the Nation of Islam. Thank you. I greet you in peace. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you. Now, just briefly, and before I get to those brief remarks, there's someone present, I haven't seen her, but the scripture says that wisdom is known of her children. And there's a lot of children around here of the Nation of Islam today. And we have our mother present. Is Mother Clara Muhammad in the audience? Would you please stand? I don't know. Yes, give her a hand, please. We would not have Islam in this part of the country if it had not been for Sister Clara Muhammad and her husband, Brother Benjamin. But I wanted to just take a few minutes to deal with something that I'm sure you've heard of, and that is Minister Farrakhan's call for a 1 million-man march. A march that is scheduled to take place in October of '95. It's not so much a march on Washington as a march in Washington. It is not a march that seeks to lay demands on government, but it is a march where we lay demands on ourselves as men who must take responsibility for ourselves, for our families, for our communities, and for our nation. At the time of the assassination, in that period of the assassination of Martin Luther King in Memphis, there was a movement taking place, and one of the placard signs that was commonly used simply stated, "I am a man." And this is because the treatment of blacks in this country over centuries has been the opposite message, that you are not human, that you are chattel, you are slaves, you are some subhuman class of being that can be manipulated and used as a tool or a slave or a soldier or whatever suits the ruling classes. And you have no rights that the ruling class of whites is bound to respect. And so we must march again in 1995 to assert that first principle, as this organization asserts so eloquently, that we are all created in the image and likeness of God. And we are not the servant or the slave of any master unless you mean God, who is the master of us all. So we must march in order to show the proper relationship between ourselves and the God who created us. He created us not to be dogs. He created us to have power and dominion over the earth. And in order to show that we are in proper relationship with our God, then we must also have the freedom to demonstrate proper relationships with our fellow human beings. We can only serve God through service through humanity, to humanity. In Islam, there is something called Adhan. The Adhan is the call to prayer, the call to worship. And so Minister Louis Farrakhan is issuing the Adhan. He is calling not only to the black people of America, but he's calling to the entire population of the country, come to prayer, come to proper worship, come to proper relationship with the God who created us all before it is too late. Come to confession, come to repentance, come to reconciliation, come to salvation. Come to salvation as an individual, but come for the salvation of the whole. This is the purpose for which we march. We have the challenge to build a new world order, not the one that George Bush is talking about, but the one that Jesus gave us in the Lord's Prayer. We must make this earth as it is in heaven, according to those heavenly principles of truth, freedom, justice, and equality. We are the people who must make it so. There is no other people. There is no one to come that makes it so. We are those that must gird up our loins and prove ourselves worthy to bring in this new world order. We cannot expect the help and the cooperation of those who are the enemies to Jesus or the enemies to Moses or the enemies to the righteous teachers down through the ages, the enemies of Mr. LaRouche, the enemies of Minister Farrakhan. We can't expect their help. We can only expect their opposition. And so we come in answer to a call to prayer. And in Islam, the prayerful ones come and they form ranks and lines as though they were a great army, and they focus their spiritual attention and power in one narrow area of focus, and that generates tremendous power. So we are coming forth to generate laser-like power against the evil that confronts us. An evil that has deprived so many millions of us of a proper family life. Where today it is said that family life is the luxury to be enjoyed by only some of us, while the majority of us must live like animals, as though we are just litters of useless human beings to be destroyed. But we must assert our right to family life. We must assert our right as men to maintain our families, to honor and respect our women by whom we reproduce ourselves. We must assert that the function of family is not just biological, but in order to produce a human being in the image and likeness of God, there must be a properly balanced family life, so that the mentality and the psychology and the spiritual dimension of our children will be that they can be the architects of the kingdom of God. We must march for the right to know the truth, for the right to have a proper education, an education that is founded on the scientific principles that give into our hands the power to sustain our lives in a lawful manner. We can no longer accept the decrepit and insane educational system that turns our sons into drug pushers, turns our daughters into prostitutes, turns our people into animalistic savages that ravage the communities in which they live. We must demand an education that fulfills our divine, helps us to fulfill our divine destiny. An education that is founded on truth, that as Jesus prophesied, would set us free. We must march to assert our natural political right. Every people is blessed by God to produce leadership for itself. Leadership that is not chosen and selected by outsiders. Leadership that is not interfered with by outsiders, but leadership that comes up from the people, the natural genius of the people, and their yearning and desire for freedom, justice, and equality produces from them leadership. But in the present instance, every time the black man and woman of America has produced such legitimate leadership, that leadership has been opposed, imprisoned, persecuted, and even assassinated. What responsibility do we have today if we know from the lessons of history that the pattern of assassination is being set up where our leadership is concerned? If we had known in the early years of the 60s that decade would bring us the assassination of President Kennedy and the assassination of Malcolm X and the assassination of King and the assassination of so many other leaders throughout the country, if we had had prior knowledge, if we had the ability to see and predict those events, what would our responsibility have been in the early 60s, what kind of action would have been required of us to prevent what we had foreseen? Well, we didn't necessarily understand it then like we understand it today. But we can clearly see that as this decade of the 90s continues, that the life of Minister Farrakhan is in jeopardy, and we can't afford to lose that life. The life of L.LaRouche is in jeopardy, and we can't afford to lose that life. Even the life of this president is in jeopardy, and we can't afford to lose the presidency at this time. And so we must march. We must march to assert the right to legitimate leadership so that we can survive. We must march to break the hold of the two parties on our political life. We must march to become politically independent, so that if there is to be a Democratic Party, if there is to be a Republican Party, then let them earn the support and the votes of the citizens. But if they really are just two branches of the same ruling establishment, then the hell with them. Let us forge an independent path to put into office those who will serve the interests, rights, and needs of the American people. And then finally, we must march to assert our economic right. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. And therefore, we as the children of God, we have an inherent right to enjoy the benefits that God has placed in the earth. So we're marching to assert that slavery was wrong for many reasons, but one of the reasons that it was wrong was because it interfered with our economic rights. The divine law of economics is that you shall work hard by the sweat of your brow, but you shall live thereby. You shall benefit from that hard work. The Quran says that soon you shall see the ends for which men strive. But slavery interfered with those natural divine principles of economics, because we certainly worked hard and lived by the sweat of our brow, but we never received the benefit of that labor and the value that we created. And now our young men are being presented. I know you won't be able to see this in the back, but this is an ad. Maybe the camera can focus in on it. But this is an ad that was in the Washington Times in November, showing a young black teenager presented like a side of beef. His kidneys are on the auction block, his lungs, his heart, his organs, his tissues on the auction block like a side of beef. An article in the Wall Street Journal in January, on sale now at your HMO, organ transplant. And they talk about the marketing of organs as a growth industry in America. We have to assert, we must march to assert that this young man is not just a collection of organs to be sold in the marketplace. His value as a collection of organs, according to the Wall Street Journal, is about $1.2 million. That's what he's worth. But we say he's worth more than that. He's a child of God. And if the gift of life through organ transplantation is freely given, we have no problem with that. That's one of the benefits of science. But if he is a disadvantaged individual, made into the enemy or the menace of society, deprived of the ability to make a legitimate living, used as some economic commodity to enrich others, then we say that we cannot accept that. And we must march to have it understood by one and all that this is a man in the image and likeness of God, and he has a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as is talked about in the Constitution. We must march, finally, for the right of development. We must march so that the Federal Reserve Bank is again under the authority of Congress, so that an economic development program can be developed that keeps a young man like this off the auction block, that prevents him from being the commodity, but allows him to be the economically and commercially aware individual that can provide for himself and his family and his community, so that he can be a participant in the ongoing march of human progress. This is why we must march. Dr. King led a march in 1963. Jobs, peace, and freedom. And they say that as a result of that march, we got the Voting Rights Act passed that allowed for a measure of political participation by minorities in the United States. But very little, if any, was accomplished in the sphere of economics. And so we must march in 1995 to complete the work that King was not able to do. But this time we have to do it with a full awareness of the threat to any who would dare to challenge the present world order, and take whatever precautions are necessary to protect the lives of those leaders that God has inspired with the vision of a new world in which we can all enjoy universal peace, freedom, love, and brotherhood. So let me close with that, and I greet you once again in peace. Assalamu alaikum.
So our question and answer period is now open. Please come to the microphones, and we're now open for questions. People, please come to the microphone and state your name, if you so desire, and where you're from, and we will begin.
My name is Victor Washington.
Okay, let's start. And this question period is just going to go until 2 o'clock, so I urge that people be brief and to the point so we can get as many questions as possible in. Yes, sir.
My name is Victor Washington, and I'm an inquiry as to why our mayor isn't here. The mayor from D.C.
It's very hard to hear you, sir. I'm sorry.
My question is, why isn't our mayor here from D.C.?
Why isn't Mayor Barry here from D.C.?
I don't know. I think he's busy with something else at the time. We were in touch with Barry's campaign when he was campaigning, but for some reason or other, since he was elected, we haven't heard much from him. So I'm not surprised he's not here. He would have been invited.
Yes.
Reverend Aaron S. Powell from Baltimore. I work with the organization, and I think an awful lot of you. And I was so happy to hear the beautiful sermon that our brother Lynn preached today, truly speaking about God and our power for getting ahead is through God. It does my heart good to see such things as this, because the Lord is our light and our salvation. Whom shall we fear? Because the Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom then shall we fear? Whom then shall we fear? The Lord is the strength of our lives. That's all of it. The Lord is the strength of our lives. Of whom then shall we be afraid. Though a host of men were laid against us, yet shall our heart be afraid. Even though there rose up war against us, even our hearts shall cling to him. That's all. God bless you and keep you. Keep on fighting, but look to God, because God has done wonders for L.LaRouche. All over the world, they're looking for him now, and they're looking for you because you backed him. Don't worry about other people why they're not here. Those are here because they want to be here.
Thank you. Lester?
I'm Lester Dahlberg from El Dorado, Texas. And over here in San Angelo, Texas, the derivatives are just about to eat that town up. They can't even build a jail without losing $3 million. But the main thing I want to ask Mr. LaRouche some questions here. Mr. LaRouche, we need to educate all these professors of our colleges about free trade, and to the extent that they can make New Greenness and Phil Graham repent of their sins of Adam Smith free trade, which has put America into the slavery that was in the 14th century, where white people were on a 7-year apprenticeship and brought over here and ended up slaves for lives. So eventually later they put black and yellow and red people into slavery. And this has been going on for a long time. Even back in England in the 15th century, people who borrowed money and had paid higher interest could not pay their debt, they had to be slaves. So this time, nowadays, we're falling in that same category. This is the system that 95% of all the wealth goes to the oligarch and 5% of the crumbs go to the poor verily to get by and die young. The name of this plan is Malthusian, to eliminate people. Mr. LaRouche, would you comment on this past history and where this took place, and also show
Lester, it's very, I'm sorry, people in the aisles are going to have to stop talking. It's very hard to hear the questions. I don't think we caught too much of what you said, Lester, so just summarize the question briefly. So
I'm just about through with it here, just a second. Okay. And then the past history which took place, and also show the way Martin Luther King brought about peace in demonstration, which he learned from Gandhi. And I also read some Hegel and Aristotle in the last EIR. You might comment a little on that, which corrupted Germany. This is all my questions here.
Something about Germany. I couldn't catch it. Lester, rephrase the question briefly, because we had a lot of trouble hearing it here.
Okay, the hearing. I'm hard of hearing myself too, but I guess it won't go.
Well, Charles, can we get that microphone turned up a little bit? It's very hard to hear.
How do you turn it up here? Oh, get it right up there here? Okay. Well, I can start over here. Mr. LaRouche.
No.
We need to educate all these professors about free trade. You know, they didn't seem to, they're teaching our kids the right opposite in our colleges. And we also, you know, need to go back and show that even the white people were slaves too, way back there. And, you know, the slavery that was brought on way back in the 15th century.
Okay, I got it.
And that we're all in the same boat together.
We got
this
it,
is what I want to comment. And
I figured it out. No, the argument is a very simple one. It's the argument which essentially was made by Henry Clay in his exposition on the impact of African-American chattel slavery on the condition of the American citizen generally. That is this. We face it now with free trade. If a man in Mexico or China works as a slave to produce a commodity without the infrastructure that we sustain and at a low wage, and if he works as a coolie at a wage where he can barely live himself, he can't support a family, then we lose a job in the United States to that slave labor abroad, or in order to avoid slave labor abroad, the American worker has to reduce his standard of living to compete at a wage competing with that foreign labor. Thus, through free trade and the absence of protection, we thus share the misery and bring people in both countries down to misery. We should not condone the use of slave labor abroad because it ruins the people from whom we take products. They should get a fair price for their labor, not a cheap price. A fair price for their labor means a fair price for the labor of our people. And free trade, by its nature, was invented to destroy nations. Because a nation that is subject to dumping is a nation that is going to be bankrupted and its people made misery. The function of government must be, which is understood by Kerry and others and Lincoln, the function of government must be measured by how do the families of the nation fare as a result of the policies of government. And if people are ground up as slaves and used up like toilet paper in order to produce commodities, then that country, no matter how much money it has, is not prosperous because its people are poor. The purpose of tariffs and trade protection was to ensure, not to provide an alternative source of revenue, tax revenue. The purpose was to protect the nation in two respects: to protect the fair price paid to the laborer for his labor by protection and price protection, and also, at the same time, to eliminate the dumping on our shores of things which we had no business buying, because buying those things would take away from our ability to buy the things for which we had a higher need, a greater priority. Now, that's the argument, Lester, is that when you have free trade, both sides of the trading arrangement suffer.
Yes.
My name is Mark Walker from Norfolk, Virginia. This question is for Dr. Muhammad. Please clarify. Everything I've read about your organization states that one of your tenets is that whites are devils. If that is true, isn't it inconsistent that you're here? If it's not true, please clarify.
Thank you for that question. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad did teach that white people should be viewed by us as devils. This was to get us out of the childish religious view that we had to worry about some evil demon down in the ground after we die, who would punish us and torture us after death. He wanted us to realize that heaven and hell are not conditions after life, but conditions of life. And depending upon the conditions of your life determined whether you were in heaven or whether you were in hell. Well, our condition for 4 centuries has been made a living hell. And the waters over that hell are devils. And so this was a way of elevating our thinking into more realistic terms and to facing up to the challenges that life presents us while we are alive. And if there is something to come after the grave, well, then we'll take that when it comes. But while we're here, let us work to make life a heaven. This was also a mirror that was put in the face of whites in America, where the slave is saying to the would-be slave master, you might call yourself a Christian, you might call yourself a Jew, but look in the mirror. This is what you look like to your slave. And you look like the worst demon that ever walked the earth, because you have raped us, you have robbed us, you have done every evil imaginable upon our heads. And we would say to white America, you know, that if you are not the devil, then you will do until the real one gets here. And if there is some other kind of devil somewhere who will arrive one day, I don't think that that devil will find any work to do, because every evil imaginable has already been done. And so this is language that, you know, causes, just the fact that you would raise that question, is language that evokes an emotional response, you know, and you want to know whether or not I believe that of you. Well, you know, all of us contain the dual principles, the potential to do good, the potential to do evil. We have tendencies that can go either way. We have given to us the example of the various prophets and the scriptures that they left, so that we can be guided in the right way, so that we can manifest the principles of truth and righteousness. However, in this world, you see, not only do we have those who are devils, but we have, in Arabic, there's a higher degree of devilish men. That there are some who reach a state that you call them shaitan. In English, you say Satan. But the difference between the devil and shaitan is that an ordinary common devil, he's evil, but his evil is confined to himself. He only hurts himself. But when you graduate to the level of shaitan and you have become a big devil, then your evil is made to affect others, and you influence them to become evil. It's like the image that they portray of this monster called Dracula. Not only is he a vampire that loves to suck the blood of human beings, but somehow or other he has the power to turn others into vampires as well. And so he's an even greater menace to society than some little devil who's stumbling around. And so we don't think that the evil that we must oppose vigorously is the evil that is born out of the ignorance of what you might call the average redneck, tobacco-chewing hillbilly somewhere that could be induced at certain times to join outfits like the Klan. That's not where the real evil is. That guy is just as much a victim as anybody else. But the real devils, the real demons, and that's why we like Mr. LaRouche, because he points these big devils out. We didn't necessarily know their names. We didn't necessarily know their address. But thanks to Mr. LaRouche and EIR and all of that, we're finding out where these big demons hang out. And we are with you in a war to destroy them before they destroy all of us.
Hi.
Yes?
Good morning. No, good afternoon. My name is Lucia Starr. I'm a voice teacher. I work with the Schiller Institute in Baltimore. I studied in Germany. I graduated in Hochschule für Musik in Berlin. Now, I have a question for Mr. LaRouche. As an educator, I teach at Catonsville Community College in Morgan State. I realized that I am a slave. So what can be done? For example, I'm an adjunct faculty, and my life depends in my paycheck from the chair of the department I work, a music department. If he doesn't like me because I rebel or complain, they just don't hire me anymore, and I don't get benefits, and I don't get anything. So how can we reach a higher education? How can we how can I tell my students, that is my moral, my problem. How can I tell my students, for example, in Morgan State University, they have these wonderful singers. They work so hard. And I have this conscious thing, where are you going to go? What's going to happen? I keep encouraging, I do the opera worship and all this, but it's very difficult. So how, I mean, how can that change, or why that happens? Why we teachers are treated like slaves? I mean, the same dean from the Caton Community College, so you are the slave of the college. That he told me in my face. So that's my question.
Well, I don't know the simple solutions to these things. I know the big ones. What I've looked for in the Washington area, in particular, over some period of time, is that because for a whole concatenation of reasons, I look at the misery of the Washington area as not misery, but as an opportunity. See, when things are bad, the good side is there's a lot of room for improvement, or shall we say a lot of opportunity for improvement. And thus, we have all these poor people in this greater Washington area. It's one of the great metropolitan regions of the world and the United States today. Now, one thing that people have, if they haven't smoked too much pot, I suppose, is they can still learn to sing, particularly if they're younger. You have a lot of children who have no connection with life in the real sense, but they can sing. Now, music, well, that's the whole story I've written a great deal about, and I'm not going to answer that in a short time here. But the point, my view is this, is to build a foundation for a musical life in the greater Washington area is one of the projects which I saw as necessary. And you know something about what tentative steps of working in that direction. When you build that, as they used to build it in Europe, in the classical periods in Europe, you build a pyramid of choruses, which starts out with little ones, learning to sing a little bel canto, and they have limitations, and they get to 5 and 6 and so forth. And you build a pyramid, which the baseline is children, little children singing. You have optimally 2 or 3 rehearsals or something a week that go on like that, which is what's needed to maintain real progress, as you know, for the children. Now, if you get the communities organized doing that, you spread that. You take, in some cases, you take these kids off the street, you may pull them out of drugs, you may pull their parents or siblings out of drugs simply because some beautiful reality has been brought into the lives of some members of that family through this kind of operation. You build a constituency on the basis of, for music, on the basis of doing what's right. What we used to have when music was developed in Europe, developed to a high degree, you had very large constituencies in the post-Renaissance period for music. It came out of the church, was the common base for doing that in those days. And you have the children's choruses that were associated with churches that were the baseline. So that the musical education program, the relationship of the teacher is not someone who's captured by an institution like you have a museum, like a living museum in a university. They have a music department. And they have a couple of people who maintain the curators of the museum. But they're not treating music seriously. They're offering it as a museum tour. Seriously, music is for the people. It gets the training, as you've seen what we're trying to do. The training of the little children and the older children in just how to sing bel canto and do chorus work and sing together. Then learn to do some genuine polyphony when they get a little bit better. Then, on the basis of once they've learned to sing, now they know how to play an instrument, unlike most instrumentalists. If you don't learn to sing, you shouldn't touch an instrument, because the job of playing an instrument is teaching the instrument to sing. You make the instrument sing. And on that basis, you build a musical constituency in the people. Then the people turn to the institutions and say to the institutions, the churches, the schools, and so forth, give us this in our school. We need this. And it's by building that kind of political constituency for the music that the institutions, such as the colleges, the junior colleges, the high schools and so forth, and the churches, will treat it seriously. So I look at it as a twofold job, is to bring together people who are teachers, who are qualified assistants, to teach the children in the communities, build programs in whatever institutions exist that will do that, churches, whatever. Build this and attack this problem with mass forces, so we can turn to the institutions and say, we want this. People say, we want this, we need this. And we can show, if they have to have the proof, we can show that a community in which more children are going regularly to chorus rehearsal and doing things where they're appearing before their peers singing, and little peers get big-eyed and watch their friends singing in the chorus, that community has less drug problem, more hope, is a better community, is better people than otherwise. And say, do you want better people? We're doing something about it. And that's the way the kind of problem you addressed, I think, will be solved politically.
Thank you so much.
When you get a chance.
My name is Christine Johnson. I'm from Chicago. And I have, during the 60s, I was the principal of the University of Islam under Elijah Muhammad. I have worked through the years, and during that time, the communists were on stage, and I traveled to the communist countries to see what they were doing. And also I traveled over most of the countries of Africa. And after I came back, I was principal for 4.5 years. And from then on, I have done a number of things. I have been reading LaRouche's papers, and he impressed me like the communists impressed me. And I came here to find out what he was doing and what they were saying. And I respect what he said today. And I wrote a number of things of what he's saying. And I was glad to see Abdul Muhammad, and I've heard about him, but I have never met him. And I know that the 100 men that, the 1,000 men that Minister Farrakhan has, and I go to his mosque quite often, and we recite and we do what we can.
I urge everyone to please get to the questions, because we only have a little time left.
Well, the question that I want is, does Mr. LaRouche carry out the things that he says he does?
My worst enemies complain that I do was the best enemy. I sure mean it.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Terry Allen from the Los Angeles area. This is a question for Mr. LaRouche. The Founding Fathers, with their obvious understanding of the evils of the British Empire and their morality and their ability to write a constitution and a Declaration of Independence, how did they allow, or why did they allow slavery to continue? Was it just pragmatism, or what was the problem there?
What you were dealing with at that period, you were dealing with a war. You're dealing with a society in general which is mixed, as I indicated. You have oligarchy. Now, if you look at the Confederacy and look at its roots, the Confederacy was created by the British. The factions which were behind the Confederacy were British, and so were some of the abolitionists. For example, the New England abolitionists, in large part, and as like Belmont, August Belmont, for example, they saw splitting the United States between pro- and anti-slavery forces as a way of destroying the United States. They didn't care about slavery. The British profited from it, they didn't care about it. Both sides. Part of the abolitionists were the Emerson types, who were part of the Mazzini Young America movement. The South Carolina Confederacy were part of the Young America movement, Mazzini. So this was an operation where the British controlled both the abolitionists and the pro-slavery forces in order to destroy the United States. Now, what's the issue? You have an army, and if you were in the army at any time, or as I was in the Second World War, you know, the army was a mixed bag. But when you went out to fight a battle, you took all the troops. And the art of warfare was keeping this mixed bag functioning as if it were not a mixed bag, all doing the same thing. The problem of the United States was that we were in a war against the most powerful and most evil forces in the world. These fellows like Franklin had no love for slavery. They wanted to destroy it from the beginning, and that's clear when you read the stuff. However, in Virginia and in certain states, they had a problem that if they moved to crush slavery, these states would go over to the British. And therefore, to keep them fighting the British on other issues, they backed down. Not that they intended to, but that's the way civilization is. We put up with things we shouldn't put up with. We do it because we can't fight. We can't fight in that way in that time. You have to realize that that's what goes on. You have to look at the issues we should be fighting that we're not, because we don't have the ability to. So what you have to do is you say, look, the question here is a question of institutions. Do you have a just institution? Is the enemy going to conquer you and put you under another institution? So you get in the situation where you're in a war against the enemy. You're in a constant revolution until we reach the point that every human being is actually freed from the kind of condition I described. Around this planet, nobody is free. We're all, at best, in a revolution struggling against the forces of evil to bring about more freedom. The way we free people from evil is to create the power to do so. The power to do so lies in defeating the enemy. Therefore, you defeat the enemy. And that's the way you have to look at it. It was wrong. There were weaknesses. Don't overestimate the Americans of the 18th century. Don't underestimate them. The leadership was powerful. That there is a direct line, as Abraham Lincoln would have insisted and did insist. We've got about 10 volumes of writings worth reading sometime. That Lincoln fulfilled the actual intent of the leading circles of the American Constitution and framers of the Constitution. The intent was to destroy this because it was always recognized that this was evil, to destroy it. And that's the way you look at it. It was not an inconsistency. It was the nature of a revolution. In order to free people from slavery, which was a British institution, you had to defeat the British. The people who were the slaveholders were the potential allies of the British.
This has to be the last question. We have to stop at 2. So, yes.
Okay. My name is Dario De Hoyos. I'm from Leesburg, Virginia. And when you spoke of working through discoveries and scientific experiments with children, and that one gets a sense of truth and of beauty of working through those, the word sense leads me to ask the question of how much does sense perception play? What kind of a role?
Very minor one. You take the case of Helen Keller, who had virtually no sense ability to communicate, but learned to do so. And Helen Keller's communications showed that there was a mind functioning there, a true human mind. Imagine someone blind and deaf from birth. What senses do they have to manifest themselves as human? But she learned to do it because she understood the intellectual power. The difference is the empiricists indoctrinate people, the Aristotelians too in general, to insist on the principle that only sense perception supplies knowledge. That is empiricism. It's related to materialism. Materialism is a form of empiricism.
If I may interrupt for a slight second. You said that Helen Keller, her intellect was there. And I mean, that is quite obvious, but from reading a story on her life, a biography of her, her teacher awakened that intellect through the sense perception.
Well, yeah, but she used the senses, but she understood things that could be seen and things that could be heard, though she could not hear, nor could she see. So therefore, the senses of hearing and the senses of sight were not the vehicle by which she understood things, concepts that could be seen and concepts that could be heard. So therefore, the corresponding sense, her knowledge of seeable things, her knowledge of hearable things, did not come from seeing or hearing, but came because she was able to develop the concept which corresponded to that, and was able to recognize that the concept was something that corresponded to other people's ability to see, to other people's ability to hear. But the concept, for example, if you did not see the Earth's curvature, how do you know the Earth is curved? What sense faculty tells you the Earth is curved? You infer it. Do you know it? Yes, you know it. The point is the location of truth lies not in sense certainty. I've written a great deal about that, and you can read some of this stuff. I write about it all the time. Truth lies in what's called the higher hypothesis. Truth is not an individual thing. It's not autistic. Mankind, as we're showing here, has increased man's power over nature, not through the senses, but through discoveries. Discoveries by which man changes man's behavior toward nature. Not sense perception at all, no sense certainty. Now man discovers by reliving the discoveries of others, that intellectual experience. Man discovers a whole series of experiences called discovery, a principle. Man recognizes that these experiences are the same. You can't see any of these experiences. You cannot see them. You cannot smell them. You cannot taste them. You cannot hear them. They exist only in the mind. You cannot communicate them with words. You can words help to set up the problem, but the action occurs only within the mind, never communicated except by inducing another person to make the same discovery themselves. When you find a succession of discoveries which then are identified, which organize the power of man over nature, which increase man's power over nature, you say, what is the nature of the universe? What we know of the nature of the universe is we know only because we know